Welcome to Crisis in Perception. I'm so glad you're joining us for this deep dive because today we're kicking off a series where we examine the hidden systems shaping our world.
And we are starting with a pretty heavy hitter today.
Yeah, we really are. For you, the listener, we are taking a fascinating and honestly somewhat unnerving plunge into Matt Taibbi's book, The Great Derangement.
The full title is actually The Great Derangement, a terrifying true story of war politics and religion at the twilight of the American Empire.
Exactly. It's a massive title for a massive topic.
It really is an incredible piece of investigative journalism
Hmm.
because it touches on something fundamental to how we operate. Entire societies often insist loudly that they care deeply about the truth.
Right.
But when you actually look at the systems shaping our public discourse, you start to realize they reward entirely different things.
Sure.
They reward identity and outrage and narrative loyalty.
And that raises a very specific, really unsettling question that serves as our mission today. What happens when politics becomes less about reality and more about choosing which reality you want to believe?
Right. And to explore that, we're going to be using excerpts from Taibbi's firsthand reporting, where he actually embedded himself with some wildly different groups across America.
Just to figure out why the country seemed to be collectively losing its grip on a shared factual universe.
But before we go any further, I need to make something explicitly clear to you, our listener. The source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
Taibbi explores extreme viewpoints from both the far left and the far right. So I want to emphasize strongly, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints or conspiracy theories or political movements described in this material.
Yeah, we are just looking at the mechanics.
Exactly. Our goal today is simply to impartially report on Taibbi's observations and convey the systems-level analysis contained in his original work. We're examining the machinery of belief, not validating the beliefs themselves.
Okay, let's unpack this. What if widespread irrationality isn't just a bug in the American political system? What if it's the predictable, almost inevitable outcome of its institutional design?
That is the core systems-level question. And to understand how Taibbi arrived at it, we actually have to look at his hilariously disastrous attempts to write this book in the first place.
Oh man, the early drafts. The genesis of this project is a story in itself.
It really highlights how difficult it is to accurately capture the true dysfunction of modern political systems without falling right into the traps those systems set up.
So to set the scene for you, Taibbi had just come off publishing his previous book, and he's contacted by his editor. The initial pitch was for him to write a sort of a rogues gallery of the worst people in American politics.
Essentially a handy reference guide full of insults aimed at political opponents.
Right. But Taibbi wormed his way out of it. He was depressed by the idea of becoming a left-wing hatchet man. He actually uses the phrase, a liberal and coulter.
Yeah, he didn't want to be pigeonholed into that highly polarized attack dog role.
Yeah.
Which is a very common trap in political media. There's a massive financial incentive to just preach to acquire and attack the designated enemy.
Because the system is designed to reward you for feeding red meat to your demographic.
Exactly. But Taibbi wanted to do something more serious, something that analyzed the structure of the theater rather than just criticizing the actors on the stage.
So he pivots to this incredibly pretentious idea for a book about what he called the thinkophancy. He wanted to expose the fake red state, blue state conflict as a fraud perpetrated by a cultural conspiracy.
And he actually wrote, what, 11,000 words of this manuscript?
11,000 words before he had a moment of horrifying clarity. He realized he had no idea what he was talking about. He literally squirmed in shame reading his own draft.
Because he knew if he published it, his career as a serious journalist would be over.
It's genuinely refreshing to hear a writer admit that level of failure.
It is. Yeah. But that failure pushed him to his third attempt, which was a year-long diary of Congress in action. He had been covering Capitol Hill and was completely shocked by how the government actually operated.
You have to remember he had lived abroad in Russia for a lot of his adult life, so he approached Washington almost like a foreign correspondent looking at an alien regime.
And what he found was not a vibrant, functioning democracy, but what he describes as a closed loop of inside players, essentially an oligarchy of commercial interests.
He makes this amazing comparison to the old Supreme Soviet. But before we get into what he means by that, can you explain what the Supreme Soviet actually was for listeners who might not know?
Certainly. The Supreme Soviet was the highest legislative body in the Soviet Union. On paper, it looked like a parliament, but in practice, it was entirely performative, a rubber stamp organization.
So they weren't actually debating laws.
Not at all. The real power, the actual decision-making regarding resources and the direction of the state, was held by the Politburo behind closed doors. The daylight sessions were just political theater to give the illusion of governance.
And Taibbi noted that the U.S. Congress operates in a disturbingly similar way. During the daylight hours when the cameras are rolling, they engage in grand, performative political debates.
Naming post offices or passing resolutions to honor local sports teams.
Or engaging in highly publicized, manufactured partisan bickering that doesn't actually threaten the bottom line of their major donors.
While the actual business of the nation happens in the dark.
Yes. Taibbi points out that the real substantive actions like gutting the Clean Air Act under the guise of an emergency response to Hurricane Katrina happen in late-night meetings of anonymous committees.
Completely out of the prying eyes of the press and the voting public.
He describes these bloated functionaries divvying up military contracts and highway concessions.
And he explicitly points out that both major political parties act as this closed loop. They operate as a highly advanced mechanism for turning political favors into campaign donations and vice versa.
A formalized system of political tribute?
Yes. The great con, as he frames it, is that the only way the public can protest all the handouts given by one party is to vote for the other party, who are entirely beholden to the exact same moneyed interests.
But wait, how does he leap from a cynical view of Congress passing bills in the dark to the idea that the entire country is experiencing a psychological break? Where does the derangement come in?
That realization hit him during what is perhaps the most visceral, chaotic anecdote in the introduction. He was trying to cover the appropriations season, that crucial period when Congress divides up the nation's wealth.
But he kept getting pulled away on international assignments, right?
Right.
The Kashmir fever dream. Right. I want to spend some time on this because the juxtaposition is so surreal. Picture this. You have Taibbi in a hotel room in Islamabad, Pakistan. He's supposed to be covering international news, but he's glued to a terrible internet connection trying to watch a C-SPAN webcast.
Of an appropriations hearing back in Washington, specifically watching Congressman Joe Barton.
Can you give a little context on what Barton was doing at that moment?
Sure. Joe Barton was the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. What Taibbi was observing through this grainy webcast was Barton orchestrating the passage of a massive energy bill.
And this wasn't an open debate.
No, this was a sprawling piece of legislation stuffed with billions of dollars in subsidies and tax breaks for oil, gas, and nuclear companies. Taibbi was watching the exact mechanics of that closed loop in action.
The smooth, coordinated handover of public wealth to private interests.
From across the globe.
And while he's trying to process the sheer scale of this quiet, bureaucratic looting, his physical environment completely unravels. He travels into Kashmir, which is a highly volatile conflict zone. He's stressed, exhausted, and he eats a fruit and nut salad prepared by his local fixer.
Which turns out to be a catastrophic mistake.
A horrible mistake. He contracts an aggressive bacterial illness.
The physical sickness really mirrors his psychological disgust with the political system he's analyzing.
It totally does. He manages to get on a flight heading home. He's sitting in his seat desperately trying to type up a section about Joe Barton manipulating the energy bill, trying to make sense of this rigged American system.
And right as he's piecing it together, his body completely gives out.
He spikes a 105-degree fever, loses consciousness, and literally collapses face first into his keyboard.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, while he is convalescing from this illness, he starts traveling across America, and he begins to observe the direct consequence of that oligarchical rigged game in Washington.
Right, because modern democratic governance fundamentally depends on a shared informational infrastructure.
Exactly. We need journalism, political institutions, and civic discourse to act as trusted filters. They're supposed to verify information and mediate our disagreements within a common factual framework.
Colin, you just used the phrase informational infrastructure, and earlier we mentioned epistemic infrastructure in our notes. I want to make sure we're not losing anyone here. We're essentially talking about the basic shared systems we use to agree on what is true, right?
Precisely. Like the mainstream press, the courts, the scientific community, or even just the basic assumption that government statistics aren't completely fabricated. The institutions that mediate reality for a society.
And when that elite network in Washington completely detaches from the public trust.
When the system operates as a closed loop that ignores the material needs of the citizens, it creates a massive vacuum. The epistemic infrastructure fractures.
Think about what that actually feels like on a human level. I mean, imagine realizing that your vote, your civic participation, really only serves to legitimize a system that actively ignores you.
It's alienating.
The politicians are putting on a theatrical play during the day, arguing about cable news controversies while quietly selling off the furniture at night. When the traditional systems no longer represent you, and more importantly, when you realize they no longer even bother to tell you the truth, what do you do?
Yeah, you don't just protest. Protesting implies you still believe the system is fundamentally sound and can be fixed with enough pressure. Instead, people begin to tune out of the mainstream entirely.
They abandon the shared reality because the shared reality feels like a scam.
But they didn't just tune out to go knit sweaters or plant community gardens. Taibbi noticed that huge chunks of the population on both the political left and the right were retreating into what he calls escapist lunacy.
And internet-fueled mysticism. They were filling that vacuum of trust with completely alternate realities.
This leads perfectly into Taibbi's profoundly dark yet illuminating thought experiment regarding Osama bin Laden. It perfectly captures how deeply the American psyche had fractured.
Yes, Taibbi asks us to look at the post-9/11 era from the perspective of Osama bin Laden. Let's map this out. Bin Laden pulls off the crime of the century, an unprecedented attack on New York City. He expects a certain kind of geopolitical reaction.
And how does the victim nation respond?
From bin Laden's point of view, it must have been immensely frustrating. Taibbi argues that America was so psychologically broken, so deeply wrapped up in its own domestic nonsense, that it wouldn't even give al-Qaeda proper credit for the attack.
Because the domestic identity-confirming narratives immediately overtook the objective reality of the event. The attack was instantly absorbed and digested by the parallel universes that were already forming in America.
Right. On the religious right, you had huge masses of people who believed New York was attacked, not because of complex Middle Eastern geopolitics, but as divine retribution, because America was allowing homosexuals to marry, or because of the ACLU.
The tragedy was instantly co-opted into a domestic culture war. The actual perpetrators were secondary to the narrative that God was punishing liberal America.
And how did the other side of the political spectrum process the event?
On the left, it was equally detached from the established facts. Taibbi notes that a supposedly educated, sophisticated set of Americans, people who pride themselves on their secular worldview, decided that Islamic terrorism was just a clever cover story.
Their narrative was that President George W. Bush personally bombed Manhattan using Saudi patsies to create a diversion so he could start a war with Saddam Hussein and seize control of oil reserves.
The symmetry there is what makes Taibbi's systems-level analysis so compelling. Bin Laden is effectively forgotten or reduced to a mere prop in both of these dominant fringe narratives.
As Taibbi puts it, America turned out to be psychologically immune to the attack because its government was too corrupt to fight back transparently, and its people were too alienated to comprehend their actual position in the world.
We had become a nation completely blind to everything outside our borders, utterly consumed by our internal mythologies.
And this brings us to what I think is the most crucial defining concept for our era that Taibbi introduces: the reality shopper.
This is the core mechanism of the derangement. For decades, the American public had been meticulously trained through advertising and media to be excellent consumers.
We were taught to browse, select, and customize our material lives. We curate our clothing, our cars, our diets to reflect our personal brands.
And Taibbi argues that this deeply ingrained consumer mindset has now been applied to truth itself. Citizens browse competing factual narratives the exact same way they browse products in a supermarket aisle.
Reality is no longer treated as an absolute verifiable thing. It's a choice. It's a lifestyle accessory selected to fit our own self-conception.
It's deeply narcissistic.
Taibbi summarizes the logic perfectly. We are Christians, therefore all world events have a Christian explanation. Or, we hate George Bush. Therefore, Bush is the secret omnipotent cause of all the bad things happening in the world.
You no longer adapt your worldview to fit the incoming facts. You simply shop for the facts that fit the worldview you've already purchased.
And he backs this theory up with some truly staggering data points that demonstrate just how deeply this institutional distrust had rotted the foundation of shared reality.
It's important to emphasize that this wasn't just a few isolated people on the fringes of the internet. This was becoming mainstream behavior.
Let's actually look at the numbers he pulled because they are shocking. A 2004 Zogby poll found that 49.3% of New York City residents believed the government knew in advance that the 9/11 attacks were coming and purposely failed to act.
Nearly half the city.
Half the city. And another survey showed that only 16% of people believed the Bush administration was telling the complete truth about 9/11.
The electoral data is even more alarming regarding the fundamental legitimacy of the government. A 2006 Zogby poll showed that only 45% of Americans were very confident that George Bush won the 2004 election fair and square.
But wait, when you dig into the demographics of that 2006 poll, that's where the reality shopper theory really hardens.
Yes.
You might expect high distrust among certain historically disenfranchised groups who have legitimate historical reasons to doubt the government. But Taibbi points out that 28% of NASCAR fans doubted the election results.
25% of born-again Christians.
And most stunningly, 32% of currently serving members of the armed forces. How does a third of the military doubt the legitimacy of the commander-in-chief they are actively serving under?
It speaks to a profound systemic failure. When a third of your own military, a deeply institutional demographic, doubts the core democratic mechanism of the nation, your epistemic infrastructure hasn't just cracked. It has completely collapsed.
The shared narrative that binds the nation together is gone. They feel like pawns in a game run by an elite class that doesn't share their values or their reality.
And the political machinery completely recognized this collapse. They didn't try to fix the trust deficit, they capitalized on it.
If people no longer believe in shared positive goals, if they don't believe the government is actually going to fix healthcare or infrastructure, you can only mobilize them through negative polarization.
Which perfectly explains the financial strategy of the 2006 election cycle.
The ad spend is wild. The political parties spent $160 million on negative advertising compared to just $17 million on positive ads, almost 10 to 1.
Elections ceased to be about competing visions for the future. They became forums for organizing the hatreds of the population.
People weren't voting for a candidate or a policy. They were voting against the demographic they loathed, heavily influenced by the negative advertising they were consuming.
But this dynamic creates an unstable equilibrium. When the traditional political system has nothing left to offer but organized hatred, and the mainstream media is viewed as an unbroken string of corporate spin, where do people go to find actual meaning in community?
They go off the deep end. They leave the traditional structures entirely. And this brings us to the absolute core of Taibbi's fieldwork.
He decides that to understand this derangement, he needs to embed himself in two entirely separate, seemingly opposite parallel universes.
An apocalyptic evangelical megachurch in Texas and the 9/11 truth movement.
On the surface, you could not find two more diverging groups. One is fundamentally religious, theological, and culturally aligned with the conservative right.
The other is secular, highly conspiratorial, and culturally leans heavily toward the dissident left.
But Taibbi finds that structurally, behaviorally, they are identical twins.
It is a brilliant sociological observation. Both groups operate by constructing completely internally consistent explanatory worlds.
They both view any external information, whether it's mainstream news, government reports, or scientific consensus, as inherently corrupt, hostile, and designed to deceive them.
And most importantly, they both offer their followers something the traditional political system has completely failed to provide: absolute certainty, a deep sense of belonging, and emotional coherence.
Let's dive into how he experienced the Texas megachurch first. Taibbi goes down to San Antonio to attend Pastor John Hagee's Cornerstone Church.
Hagee is a massive figure, a huge proponent of Christian Zionism who had a direct line to the White House at the time. He's preaching a very specific apocalyptic vision of the Middle East.
But what Taibbi observes isn't just the theology. It's the brilliant organizational structure of this megachurch. It isn't just a giant auditorium where people passively listen to a sermon on Sunday and go home.
It is a highly sophisticated hierarchical community. The congregation of tens of thousands is broken down into 12 tribes, and within those tribes are much smaller, intimate cells.
These cells meet weekly for Bible study, offer financial advice, provide marriage counseling, and essentially act as an extended family structure.
And Taibbi makes a very provocative comparison here. He explicitly compares this cell structure to al-Qaeda's organization. Now, obviously, he's not comparing their actions or their morality.
He is talking strictly about their logistics.
Right. He notes how this cellular structure brilliantly transforms what is essentially an impersonal, massive religious corporation into an incredibly intimate, tight-knit family unit.
It binds the individual to the group in a way traditional broadcast-style politics simply cannot match. It creates a captive audience by fulfilling fundamental human needs.
When your entire social support network, your emotional well-being, your weekend activities, and your overarching worldview are all provided by this one localized cell, you become completely insulated from outside reality.
If a mainstream news report contradicts the teachings of your cell leader, you reject the news report, because accepting it would mean risking your entire social foundation.
Taibbi actually experienced the intense gravitational pull of this insulation himself. He talks about trying to maintain his journalistic distance, his Christian mannequin, he calls it.
He's just pretending to fit in taking notes.
But he starts losing control of the mannequin. He catches himself during a massive Sunday service with his hands in the air in full freeze motherfucker mode, as he eloquently puts it, with a dumb, blissful smile on his face, belting out the hymns along with thousands of other people.
Why does that happen to a cynical, hardened, internationally experienced political reporter? How does the environment overwhelm his critical faculties?
Because the outside world is utterly miserable. He writes about his life outside the church walls, sitting through desperately sad conversations with middle-aged depressives who think Satan is the reason their kids don't call them anymore.
Drinking cheap, watery powdered iced tea in squalid, decaying strip malls.
Dealing with the sheer atomized misery of daily American life where nobody knows their neighbors and everyone is stressed about debt.
The contrast is the key.
Yes. After enough of that mundane misery, stepping into this arena with its cool, sanitary air conditioning, razor-sharp acoustics, and a million-piece chorus feels like a Rolling Stones concert.
It's a rush of endorphins. It's profound sensory and emotional relief.
But the theology almost doesn't matter. The community and the sensory experience are the ultimate escape from a broken society.
And that profound desire for escape, for a coherent narrative that explains away the chaos and isolation of the modern world, is exactly what he finds on the other side of the political spectrum with the 9/11 truthers.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the execution is so different, but the psychological need is identical. Taibbi goes to an Austin, Texas meeting of the 9/11 Truth Movement.
Now, if you read the mainstream press at the time, you might picture a highly organized, dangerous group of radicalized individuals plotting the downfall of the state.
But what does Taibbi actually find when he walks into this meeting?
He finds a group of 25 to 30 people in a little church on the outskirts of town, led by a breezy, ineffectual moderator. And the meeting completely devolves into a pointless, chaotic speech-making session.
They aren't planning concrete political action. They aren't organizing a voting bloc or drafting legislation. They are simply performing their identities for one another.
That is the crucial distinction. Their political engagement has become entirely performative and therapeutic rather than practical.
Every single person stands up and gives an elaborate, angry speech to no one in particular about their own highly customized personal theory of the grand conspiracy.
One person blames the British royal family. The next person stands up and blames the international bankers and the Rothschilds.
Another blames the Trilateral Commission. One woman even gets up and details a massive conspiracy to hide the discovery of alien technologies at Area 51.
And how do they synthesize these wildly contradictory theories?
They don't. They just politely listen to each other's distinct paranoias. They accomplish absolutely nothing except, as Taibbi notes, scheduling another meeting for next week.
He observes that they're acting like frightened adolescents, playing at being revolutionaries. They're completely unaccustomed to the actual burdens or mechanics of political power.
They just want a space where their feeling of powerlessness is validated by a grand, sweeping narrative.
There's a profound irony in the nature of their rebellion, which Taibbi captures perfectly when the group decides to screen the 1976 Hollywood movie network in the church.
Oh man, this is the absolute peak of the derangement. So Network is this brilliant, cynical Sidney Lumet film about a news anchor who has a mental breakdown on live television. And the corporate network decides to exploit his breakdown for ratings.
It's the ultimate critique of corporate media conglomerates prioritizing profit over truth and human decency.
And how do the truthers consume this film? They are sitting in this little church with a cinema screen placed right in front of a stained glass window watching network, a film produced and distributed by the very corporate media machine they despise.
But they are consuming it as an unvarnished canonical revolutionary tract. They treat it like a documentary.
Taibbi notes they also heavily cite The Matrix and V for Vendetta. They are deducing the existence of a massive, shadowy, flawlessly executed global conspiracy using the exact same commercial mass media they claim is entirely comprised of lies.
They're literally reality shopping from the Hollywood bargain bin. They construct their entire political ideology out of pop culture tropes provided by the corporations they claim to be fighting.
And when Taibbi attempts to point out these glaring contradictions or even lightly mocks their disorganized paranoia in a column for Alternet, the backlash is immediate, visceral, and
It
vicious.
was explosive.
He thought he was just making a quick observational punchline about black helicopter paranoia being reconfigured for left-leaning dissidents. But his inbox flooded with thousands of emails of pure hate mail.
They called him a left gatekeeper cocksucker. They said he was clinically insane. People actively threatened physical violence against him.
Taibbi notes that even when he previously wrote a highly controversial column celebrating the death of the Pope, he didn't get a fraction of this specific kind of vitriol.
Why the extreme defensiveness?
The truth movement, he realizes, is defined by a burning, defensive hypersensitivity. They leap out of their seats in anger because their entire identity is wrapped up in this narrative.
If you challenge the theory, you aren't just debating facts. You're threatening the one thing that gives their life meaning and community. You are threatening their bespoke reality.
If we connect this back to Taibbi's systemic analysis of Washington, he points out a fundamental, almost tragic misunderstanding these movements have of the American ruling class.
Yes, this is my favorite insight in the book. The truthers imagine the government is staffed by a monolithic, hyper-competent cabal of swashbuckling supervillains.
They think Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz are sitting in a dark room pulling off these flawless, born supremacy-style false flag operations in broad daylight, rigging demolition charges in skyscrapers without leaving a single verifiable trace.
But the reality of Washington, as Taibbi saw firsthand while trying to cover those appropriations committees, is entirely mundanely different.
The government isn't a Spectre headquarters from a James Bond film. Taibbi describes it as a low-rent timeshare property.
The people in power are not evil geniuses. They are mundanely greedy, risk-averse, lawn-tending suburbanites.
They don't orchestrate massive, convoluted mass murder conspiracies to start a war because, frankly, getting the American public to go to war has historically never been that hard. They just lie on television and the media repeats it.
These politicians are there to quietly pass $14 billion energy tax breaks / fuel efficiency standards for their donors, collect their campaign checks, and then go golf in Scotland.
As Taibbi argues, the conspiracy theories actually flatter the political elite by making them seem vastly more competent, unified, and dangerous than they actually are.
It is a narcissistic pipe dream for a population that feels powerless. It is psychologically much easier to imagine you are a lone warrior battling an omnipotent, demonic, evil empire than to admit the depressing truth.
You spent 50 years participating in a system that elects banal mediocrities who openly hand your tax money to their business cronies while you weren't paying attention. So how did the environment get so toxic, so detached from baseline reality, that these parallel universes became the norm? Why did the epistemic infrastructure shatter so completely?
Taibbi points directly at the media bubble. And to illustrate this, he uses one of the most powerful evocative metaphors in the entire book, drawn from his time embedded with the U.S. military in Baghdad.
This sequence really encapsulates the crisis of perception. It physically manifests the psychological state of the American public.
Taibbi is in Iraq spending time on the Forward Operating Bases, or FOBs. He describes these bases as having massive 30-foot-tall concrete blast walls lined with razor wire.
He calls them Skull Island walls, these masterpieces of architectural overkill.
But the profound realization he has is that these walls are designed not just to keep the insurgents out, but to keep the Americans completely sealed in.
And inside those walls, within that controlled environment, a very specific performance is taking place.
Right. He's hanging out with a group of young, earnest military police officers. And because there's a reporter present, they immediately put on a cheerful cinematic show. They have watched so much television that they unconsciously adopt movie tropes to explain themselves.
Each grunt introduces himself with a witty line. "I'm the token African guy," says one kid from New York. Another says, "I'm soft-spoken and wholesome, but also offended easily."
Inside the bubble of the FOB, they know their roles perfectly. They have a frame of reference. They make sense to themselves and to the reporter.
But the moment they step outside that heavily fortified bubble,
It's total unmitigated chaos.
Yeah.
They leave the FOB to visit a local police station in an unfriendly sector of Baghdad. Suddenly, a huge explosion goes off nearby. Small arms fire starts echoing down the streets.
the local Iraqi police are too terrified to even go outside and investigate. And these young American kids who are supposedly there to transition power and confidently lead the local police force are just sitting there in their armored vehicles.
They have absolutely no idea what is happening. They don't know who's blowing things up 100 yards away. They don't know the factions involved. And on a deeper level, they don't really know why they are there.
Outside the manufactured reality of their bubble, they are completely blind and defenseless against the complexity of the truth.
And Taibbi recognizes that this is a profound, terrifying metaphor for the American public's relationship with the world and with objective facts.
We live in a massive domestic FOB. Inside our algorithmic media bubbles, our Fox News or MSNBC ecosystems, our tailored Twitter feeds, we have our scripts, our characters, our assigned outrage points.
Everything makes sense. We know who the good guys and bad guys are.
But outside of that artificial environment, the real world is a complex, dangerous mystery that most people have completely given up trying to understand.
If you can find your search for meaning entirely within the safety of the bubble, you inevitably end up with absurd, simplistic explanations for complex events.
You end up believing they hate us for our freedom, or 9/11 was an inside job orchestrated by holograms.
What's fascinating here is how the mainstream media, and specifically the advertising industry, prepared the psychological ground for this kind of societal psychosis over decades.
Taibbi points to the 1980s as the specific moment we crossed the Rubicon into a post-truth media landscape, highlighting a very specific cultural artifact, the Joe Isuzu commercials.
I found this observation so sharp.
So in the 1980s, the American public was finally starting to catch on that television advertising was mostly transparent bullshit. People realized there aren't really 4 out of 5 independent dentists passionately recommending a specific brand of chewing gum.
Madison Avenue realizes the gig is up, the public is becoming cynical, so they create the character Joe Isuzu.
He's a slick, mercury-tongued pitchman who comes on TV with a massive serpentine smile and openly, blatantly lies to you. He claims an Isuzu truck has more seats than the Astrodome, or that it costs $9.
It was ironic advertising. The creators were scoring honesty points with a cynical public by openly acknowledging that they were lying. The lie became the entertainment.
But the cognitive dissonance is that these ironic, self-aware ads were playing right alongside traditional ads meant to be taken completely seriously. You couldn't tell what was earnest and what was a meta joke.
And then the commercial break ends, the news comes back on, and President Ronald Reagan gets on television.
Who Taibbi calls Joe Isuzu's perfect Dostoevskian double meaning, his dark real-world reflection. In one breath, Reagan lies brazenly and smoothly to the public about trading arms for hostages in the Iran-Contra affair. And in the next breath, he jokingly compares his political enemies to Joe Isuzu.
The lines between objective reality, advertising, political spin, and entertainment were not just blurred, they were completely obliterated.
Yeah.
The American public was forced to rummage for objective reality in a sea of confusing, diabolical bullshit.
And over decades of this constant epistemic degradation, the public's capacity to process actual truth naturally eroded. The public just became completely numb to absurdity.
Taibbi perfectly captures this societal numbness with a grimly funny story about being at a bowling alley with a friend.
Taibbi is trying to tell her a horrific true story about an old acquaintance who had a severe psychological breakdown. The guy got committed to a hospital, managed to escape his room, and in a state of delirium crushed both his hands in the heavy metal door of a walk-in freezer.
A deeply tragic, visceral story of human suffering.
Utterly horrific. He shatters all the bones, he goes back to the hospital, contracts a severe staph infection, and ultimately has to have both hands amputated at the wrist.
And Taibbi finishes recounting this incredibly grim story by mentioning, almost as an aside, that the guy at least found religion in the aftermath and is a devout Christian now.
And his friend at the bowling alley, who has barely been processing the horror of the story, just cheerfully says, "Oh, well, that's good. At least the story has a happy ending." And then she immediately steps up to the lane, rolls the ball, and yells, "Strike."
It illustrates a total detachment from physical reality, a societal inability to process basic grim facts because the media and environment has trained us to only respond to tidy, emotionally satisfying narratives.
If the story ends with "he found Jesus," the brain categorizes it as a happy ending, completely overriding the reality of a man losing both his hands. So you listening right now might be wondering, why does this matter?
Okay, so people are numb, they're susceptible to advertising, and they live in self-constructed bubbles. So what? Why is this a crisis?
It matters fundamentally because democratic politics relies on community and shared reality.
But as Taibbi observes, we are no longer a community. We have been split up and atomized into a collection of target demographics. In the exact same way we shop for cars or streaming services, we pick our means of political protest.
We scan the media landscape for the narrative that appeals to our aesthetic, and we buy into it.
And when different demographic groups no longer share a common epistemic framework, when they literally don't even agree on what basic observable facts are, real debate is impossible.
You can't argue tax policy or healthcare with someone who believes the government is run by alien hiding Satanists. And they can't argue with you if they think you are a brainwashed sheep serving the New World Order.
We are arguing from entirely different realities. The mechanism of democracy seizes up.
But towards the very end of his investigation, Taibbi identifies a potential shift. The old paradigm might actually be fracturing in a way that creates a new, entirely different kind of political fault line.
So what does this all mean? We've got a broken legislative system, a population retreating into escapist lunacy, and a media ecosystem that feeds the flames for profit. Where does it go from here?
Taibbi noticed something genuinely new happening on the fringes during the 2008 election cycle. He saw a convergence of the extremes.
The old crossfire paradigm, the neat, media-orchestrated televised division of red state versus blue state, began to break down at the grassroots level.
He noticed this specifically around Ron Paul's presidential campaign. Taibbi goes to these Republican rallies and sees Ron Paul supporters who look sound and act almost indistinguishably from the hardcore liberal supporters of Dennis Kucinich on the left.
The traditional left-right dichotomies, the carefully managed partisan talking points, were completely dissolving for these groups.
Completely. These ex-Republicans, these former conservative ditto heads who used to listen to Rush Limbaugh, were suddenly aggressively anti-war.
They were speaking out passionately against the conspiracy of corporate business interests dominating Washington.
They were talking about peak oil and the nefarious influence of the Council on Foreign Relations. They shared the exact same foundational distrust of the establishment as the left-wing dissidents.
They were experiencing what they called a matrix moment, taking the red pill, looking past the partisan bickering, and realizing the entire mainstream political theater was a manufactured lie.
Which suggests that the real divide in American politics is no longer left versus right or conservative versus liberal. Those are just the daylight hours in the Supreme Soviet.
No Taibbi defines the new emerging fault line as on the farm versus off the farm.
The people on the farm still believe the CNN, Fox News, Democrat, Republican, red-blue theater is real. They believe their votes in that paradigm matter.
The people off the farm, whether they arrive there via left-wing critique or right-wing conspiracy, have realized the game is rigged by the closed loop of insiders.
And if we look at the systemic implications of this, why does this convergence, this movement off the farm matter so much?
Because if the population splinters into a million little pieces based on individualized, shared economic grievances, rather than being neatly organized into two easily managed warring factions, it presents a massive existential threat to the corrupt elite.
Precisely. The establishment maintains power through symmetrical polarization. It is much easier to control a population, to keep them from looking at how the money is spent, if you can just point across the aisle and say, be terrified of them.
Yes, if you can get families hating each other at Thanksgiving over media-generated culture war trifles over what a celebrity said or a brand of beer, nobody's looking at the Pentagon budget.
Nobody's looking at the billions in corporate tax giveaways Joe Barton is sliding through committee. But you can't control a population through partisan hatred if the population realizes that everyone, regardless of their party registration, is equally being treated as a sucker.
As Taibbi writes, if we're all equally a bunch of suckers, how could any of us be worth hating? Only a madman wastes his time hating a sucker.
When the people off the farm realize they're all paying exorbitant prices for gas drowning in debt and losing their health care, while the politicians golf in Scotland, the illusion shatters.
It represents a moment where the crisis in perception might actually give way to a moment of terrifying, chaotic clarity. The institutions fail, the media narratives collapse, and the citizens are left looking at each other without the artificial filters of the two-party system.
And that brings us right back to you, the listener. The core crisis Taibbi outlines in The Great Derangement isn't just that people are prone to irrationality or that conspiracy theories exist, it's much deeper.
It's that the very systems responsible for producing a shared verifiable reality have completely fractured. We are no longer inheriting a common truth. We are reality shopping to soothe our anxieties.
Which requires a great deal of self-reflection from all of us. I want you to think about your own information habits. When you consume news, are you looking for facts or are you shopping for confirmation?
Which comfortable bubbles have you built for yourself? Which uncomfortable truths have you walled off because they don't fit the narrative you've purchased for your own identity?
Are you on the farm arguing over the script they handed you, or are you off the farm?
And I will leave you with a final, perhaps slightly darker thought to mull over, building on Taibbi's premise. If our civic participation has truly been reduced to browsing realities, like a consumer shopping for comfort, what happens when the products available on the ideological market completely sever their ties to the physical world?
With the rise of synthetic media, algorithmic echo chambers, and AI-generated realities that can perfectly simulate whatever you want to hear, will future historians look back at our vaunted information age not as an era of enlightenment, but as a digital dark age of voluntary, customized isolation?
When you can conjure any reality you wish and never have to face the friction of disagreement, why would you ever choose to live in the shared one?
Wow. That is definitely something to keep you up at night. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.